In the early 1900s, the urban population was on the rise. And where's everybody coming from? Well, as we talked about before, during the Gilded Age in the late 1800s, a lot of people were coming from the rural areas, right? These people used to be farm owners, or maybe they were tenants in the rural areas, and they were going to the cities to try to find work. Maybe they lost their land, maybe they came on hard economic times and they were looking for a job. They were going to become wage laborers, right? But then you also have millions of individuals coming from overseas and some coming from the South, right? Coming from Mexico. So you had a large increase in immigration during this period in the early 1900s as well, right? You got millions of people coming from Europe, right? And we talked about the change in immigration patterns, right? So you have a lot of individuals coming from Southern Europe, Eastern Europe. These are impoverished areas where people were struggling at the time. So they're coming to the United States, trying to find a better life. You also have immigrants coming from Japan on the West Coast. We talked about the Exclusion Act, which stopped Chinese immigration, but Japanese immigration continued in the early 1900s. And then you have migration from Mexico as well, right? So we have increased immigration. You got population movement from the rural areas to the urban areas. And so now you got a lot of people in the cities, right? And there's a big demand for farm produce. So the farmers, for them, it's a good thing because there's a big demand. That means they could start producing more and more food, sell more food, and make more money, right? Because we talked about the farmers and their economic situation in the past. Talk a little bit more about them as we move on. But in these cities, there are some socioeconomic issues, okay? Inequalities, right? So what are some of these inequalities? Well, a lot of the immigrants who were coming to the United States, they were willing to work for fairly low wages because low wages in the United States were still higher than wages from their home or in their home countries, right? And so you have a lot of individuals making very low wages. They have, in some cases, large families, right? And so you have these overcrowded tenements, right? A tenement, think of it like a one-bedroom apartment, right? Kind of like a studio, sometimes maybe a little bit bigger, but you got multiple people crammed into these really small tenements, and sometimes the living conditions were quite horrible. You have a lot of the immigrants who were coming to the United States, especially from Europe, Eastern Europe, Southern Europe, living in ethnic neighborhoods when they arrived. Many immigrants arrived on the East Coast, coming into Ellis Island, right off of New York. You know, the Statue of Liberty is right around that area today. And so you have a lot of individuals arriving there. And once they arrive, you know, they want to live in neighborhoods where their countrymen are, right? Where people speak their language, where some of their customs are still upheld, and they're living their traditions to a certain degree, but just in a new environment, where local shops are owned by individuals from their ethnic group, right? So there's these ethnic neighborhoods developing because of all the immigration to the United States. And many of these immigrants are working in industrial jobs, right? But they aren't getting the high-paying skilled labor jobs. Mostly they're getting the low-skilled or semi-skilled jobs working in factories, right? So we talk a little bit about the horrible living conditions that immigrants were living in many cases in these large cities. Well, you have a number of journalists who began to speak up about this, right? Start to write stories about it, taking pictures and publicizing the horrible conditions that people were living in poverty, basically, right? And so these type of journalists who are kind of taking a moral aspect to journalism, they're trying to bring about social change. You could even say social justice. They were called muckrakers by people who opposed them. That term was actually coined by President Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt. We'll talk a little bit about him later, right? But these muckraker journalists were trying to expose some of the inequalities that were going on in society, some of the social injustices that were happening at the time. Around this time, you start to see a new type of freedom in the United States, right? We talk about freedom throughout this entire course. There's different definitions of freedom. Now we'll talk a little bit about economic freedom, right? And there's a lot of aspects to economic freedom, but the one that we're going to focus on for now is consumer freedom, right? The freedom to buy, spend, and get all the cool gadgets out there on the market, right? The right to have a living wage, or to make a living wage where you're making a good enough living to participate in this new consumer economy. We talked about at the end of the 1800s, in the Gilded Age, right, where all these inventions were being created, and now all of a sudden you have phonographs and radios and telephones, and people want to buy all this stuff, clothing, you know, all the things that people want to consume in the market, right? And so now you have a lot of more people working in factories and within industries, and the industries are starting to develop and grow in the United States, and so they want to have the freedom to now take their wages and go buy all this stuff, right? Consumerism. Right, we're seeing the development of consumerism in the United States. You got department stores located in downtown areas, right? You know what a department store is, right? You go into a big store and they got several different departments. You know, they got the shoe department, they got clothing department, they may even have a hardware department, right? You know these stores. Today we got Walmart. That's a department store, right? But we took it to the next level, right? But at the time, you're starting to see these types of stores develop in downtown areas within neighborhoods, and people are starting to become big-time consumers. Women are also getting involved in consumerism because more women are now working, right? There's more job availability for women at this time. And it's not just unmarried women, which was the pattern beforehand. Now, as we get into the early 1900s, you have married women as well. Who are finding jobs and are working in the economy, right? Maybe trying to get a little bit of economic independence in the relationship. So you have women more and more being a part of public life. Whereas before, as you go back into the early 1800s, into the 1700s, and before that, you have women mostly in the domestic sphere. That's what they called it. Right? Women just working in the home, like taking care of the home, taking care of the children. But now, you have women coming out more, and women have jobs, and they can buy things, and they can be independent financially, right? And so women are becoming more visible in public life. Okay, as this economy is starting to develop more and more, it's moving more towards the direction of something that's called Fordism, named after Henry Ford. Right? And what Fordism is referring to is the direction that the economy was moving in. We're talking about mass production, right? The production of goods at a level never before seen. Okay, so mass producing goods in these factories, and then you have also mass consumption as people now have their wages because they're working, not as many small farmers, and they're going out to spend their wages and consume. Okay, so Fordism, it's named after Henry Ford, all right? You guys know who Henry Ford is, right? The Ford Motor Company, right? Ford, the cars, right? American built, all that good stuff. Okay, so Ford is going to develop his own automobile company, right? And he makes his cars pretty affordable for the average American, right? You're going to see the sales of automobiles spike huge, and a huge percentage of the population is eventually going to own vehicles, either from Ford or General Motors, right? Quality, it's not the best. It's not as good as Europe. You know, still kind of the same thing today, but it's affordable. People can get it. And part of the reason why it's affordable is because of the assembly line, okay? Developed by Henry Ford, 1913. Right? Hence Fordism. Anyone ever work on an assembly line before? I have. I worked on an assembly line, not making cars, but making mattresses, right? And that's fun, right? You stand by a conveyor belt all day, and the product is coming down the conveyor belt, and you do whatever you're going to do to it in your little station, and it moves on to the next station, and then the other workers, do what they need to do until the product is fully assembled, packaged, and ready to go. It's very efficient. You can make a lot of product that way. Mass production, Fordism, okay? And you might get paid pretty good. Henry Ford paid his people pretty good. $5 an hour. Hey, that's awesome. At the time, people were not making anywhere near that much, right? So other employers are looking at Ford like, what are you doing, Ford? Why are you paying them this much? But Ford had a vision, and his vision was, hey, people need money so they can go out and contribute to this consumer economy, buy their telephones, buy their radios, have a living wage, whatever, and so he's contributing to that.